So are induction kits a good mod for your car? What are induction kits? How do they work? What are the pros and cons of fitting an induction kit? We're going to answer all of those questions, and we're going to have an unbiased look at induction kits. The last thing we want you to do is to make your intake suck. Well, we kind of want it to suck, but not suck, if you know what I mean. And we're going to look at why some cars lose power when you fit an induction kit. So stay tuned to find out the truth about induction kits and your car. So the theory is that the more air you can get into an engine, the more fuel you can burn and the more power you make. It's a simple triangle when it comes to making more power: fuel, air and heat. So does your car's intake suck? Does it suck in a bad way, or does it suck in a really good way? Are induction kits worth doing? What about performance panel filters? We're going to have an unbiased look at the world of air intake mods and help you decide what's best for you, your car and your project. And we're going to blow out of the water some of the common myths around these very popular mods that we see people fitting all the time. So the general idea behind induction kits is to allow more air into the engine. Now, we've seen boxes of induction kits that boast an extra 50 brake horsepower. We've seen boxes that claim to flow 3 times more air than the standard airbox. So we're going to look at some of those claims and see just how they stack up in reality. So firstly, if I was selling an induction kit, I would take a large capacity engine that's got a very restricted intake on it. I would add lots of mods to it. I would put it on the dyno before I put the intake on it, and then I would dyno it again afterwards, and then I would see quite a big power gain, because basically you're going from a restriction to no restriction and you will see a power gain. And that's what I would put on the box. This induction kit gives up to 50 horsepower more power. So the other claim that we spoke about was the 3 times more airflow. Now, if you're in a lab and you're blowing air through the filter, you can increase the capacity by 3 times, and that is probably well beyond the scope of what your standard air box and air filter is able to handle. But in reality, can the engine use 3 times more air? So when you add an induction kit, you are really looking to just remove a restriction within the system. So manufacturers are not daft. They want the engine to be efficient, and it wouldn't make sense to churn out an engine in the modern emissions requirements that they have to meet that's got a restricted airflow which is holding back the overall efficiency of the engine. So a lot of research and development goes into the stock factory airbox. So it's basically a plastic box. There's generally some kind of fin structure in there to allow the air to flow through the filter as a whole, rather than just take a shortcut through the filter. That also cuts down the noise that you get from the intake of your car. But is it a restriction? Well, in most cars that I look at, and most cars that go on the dyno, there is not very much of a restriction. Typical power gains through adding induction kits is about 2 to 4%, which is negligible. Most people would agree that for you to actually notice a power difference, it needs to be around about 10%. So potentially you're paying quite a bit of money for an induction kit that's not going to add very much power to a stock engine. It helps to know your car very well too. Some cars actually make less power when you fit an induction kit. So one thing to get your head round, and it's quite an important factor, it's that the flow rate velocity is far more important than the cubic feet per minute of air that you flow into the engine. So if you take a large bore pipe, it will be able to flow more air per minute, but the velocity will be significantly slower. We could illustrate this by looking at a garden hose. If there's nothing on the end of the hose, the water will dribble out, but you will probably get a decent flow of water looking at the volume that's coming out of it. But as soon as you put a nozzle on the end of the hose pipe, the velocity shoots up, and you really do need that velocity going into the engine. So a common mistake people make with induction kits is having a very large intake pipe that then narrows and causes a bottleneck as it goes into the engine, and that will completely ruin your airflow and sap your power. But it helps to know your engine very well, because there's some very specific engines out there that really do not respond very well to induction kits. The Mazda RX-8 is one. It's a Wankel rotary engine in there, and there's a lot of engineering and design that's gone into the intake and the airbox. When you put a stock pod filter on that, you will generally see a decrease in power. It's not as efficient as what Mazda originally put onto it. And a high revving engine like the Honda S2000, you you will typically see a gain of about 6.7 horsepower, which is only 4% more power. So although you will make more power on that engine, it's not significant. It's nothing to write home about, and you really are better off spending your money elsewhere. So other motivations for fitting an induction kit might include the induction roar. And if you want your engine to be more noisy and you feel that that's going to add to your enjoyment of the car as a whole, then that makes a lot of sense. Go for it, fit that induction kit, get the roar, but don't expect a massive power gain. Now things change very slightly when you've increased the power of the engine dramatically, because you're now working outside the constraints of the OEM factory airbox design. It was designed to flow slightly more air than it needed as standard, but now your engine is sucking in a lot more air. That's become a restriction. So at that point it's worth thinking about upgrading the intake system. And for most people I would still recommend you just fit a performance panel filter. Now they will flow better than the paper filters. We should also say as well that because a filter is flowing better, it's doing less filtering. So it's practically impossible to filter the air as much as the standard paper filter and keep the airflow unless you go to a much larger filter, and there's often not enough room in an engine bay to make that sort of size increase in the filter. So keeping it all in the standard airbox with a higher flowing filter is a nice tidy solution. It's still using whatever the factory set up to optimize the intake for the engine, and unless you've got a really rubbish design on your intake system, it's the best way of just removing that restriction that you've now got. When it comes to adding pod filters, cone filters and full induction kits, you need to be aware that if it's sited in the engine bay, it's going to be pulling in a lot of warm air from the engine bay, and warm air, as we all know, carries less oxygen, and less oxygen means you'll be able to burn less fuel, so you'll be slightly down on power. Now one of our members did an interesting set of measurements on his car. He took it on quarter-mile runs and measured the intake temperatures of an open airbox and just compared that with the quarter-mile runs that he was doing. And it was interesting that by the time the car has moved quarter of a mile, the air coming into the engine bay has pretty much flushed out all of that hot air. So as long as the car is moving and it's moving at a fairly rapid pace, you shouldn't get too much of a restriction from the warm engine bay temperatures that are there. But if it was an issue, then putting some vents on the top of the engine bay can make quite a big difference, and it will just aid the airflow. But be careful you're not diverting the airflow from the radiator, which is actually where you desperately need it. Or add a cold air feed pipe. Now be careful, don't locate it too far down where it's going to suck in water, because the last thing you ever want to do is suck water into your engine. You will pretty much kill your engine with hydrolock if you get water in there. So bear that in mind, and most manufacturers supply cars that have some kind of ducting to channel fresh air from outside towards the air filter box, so you might even be able to utilize this in your design. So do induction kits add power? Well, technically I have to say they do. Looking at all the dyno results, most cars will make a little bit more power, but to be honest, you are not going to notice it. You're wasting your money if you expect a power gain on a stock engine with just an induction kit added. But if you've tuned your engine and you're making a lot more power than you would have done originally, then it makes sense to upgrade the induction kit. But choose carefully, look at the volume of your standard airbox and just make sure you're not fitting a cone filter that's much smaller. If you've decreased the surface area of the filter, you've decreased the airflow. And sad to say, a lot of the cheap aftermarket air filters and induction kits that are sold actually flow pretty badly. They're just literally trying to take money off you for the concept of having a power increase and are offering a power decrease. So do your research carefully. We've got articles on our site that go into more detail when it comes to induction kits. We've got engine and car specific tuning guides that detail exactly what people have used, what works, what doesn't work, and what we think about the different upgrades for your personal car. So please stay tuned. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. We've got lots more in-depth articles coming up, in-depth videos coming up, looking at different mods for your car, just to help you to get the maximum performance benefit from your money that you're spending on your car project.